You surrender. The banners are lowered. Men in armor unclench their fists and step forward under a white flag. A voice promises mercy. Leave your weapons, your lives will be spared. You let yourself believe it. You file into the square and wait. Then the earth opens, not in battle, but under the command of a conqueror who turned legalistic promises and theatrical mercy into a different kind of warfare. The promise had a condition he alone would define, and when he defined it, it became a lesson carved into the memory of an entire region. If dark history is your thing, subscribe. We dive deeper every week. This is Tamerlane, Timur. The name appears in many spellings across sources. Timur, 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 Tamerlane, but the man they point to is the same. A late 14th century Central Asian warlord who fashioned an empire out of martial brilliance, strategic calculation, and a deliberate policy of terror. Not simply a bloodthirsty tyrant without method, Timur was a patient architect of reputation. He inherited, adopted, and adapted Mongol practices of mobility and ruthlessness. He learned how to make horror an instrument, not just an effect. To understand how he changed history, we have to look at particular acts, carefully, soberly, and with the caveat that the records from the period are often both vivid and partisan. Timur rose from the steppes to a degree of power that transformed the political geography from the Caspian to the Indus. He styled himself as a restorer of the Mongol imperial legacy, marrying himself to the idea of Genghis Khan's dominion while not being a direct descendant. His physical nickname, the Lame, came from a battle injury that left him with a limp. That detail became part of the legend. A cripple, remade into a general who could outmaneuver larger armies and outthink entrenched rulers. He surrounded himself with scholars, craftsmen, and artists. He patronized architecture and poetry, building ornate palaces and mosques even as his armies razed cities elsewhere. It is precisely this paradox, the cultivated court and the scorched countryside, that makes his story one of the most disturbing chapters in medieval history. Timur's cruelty was not random. It was often purposeful, theatrical, and calibrated. The first act we will examine exposes the fusion of legalism and terror. A surrender promised safe conduct and then twisted into a sentence. Sivas in Anatolia sits at the crossroads of caravan routes. In one of his early Anatolian campaigns against the remnants of rival Turkish beyliks and the Ottoman frontier, Timur confronted small garrisons and city authorities who had a choice: fight on or accept terms. Chroniclers of the era, writing for courts that had reasons to vilify or lionize Timur, record a scene repeated in different places with unnerving precision. They say the garrison was told, "Hand over your arms, come out under guarantees of no bloodshed." The soldiers complied.
They believed they had negotiated their survival. Then, according to these witnesses, a different reading of the promise unfolded. Medieval chroniclers report that after the surrender, rows of soldiers were driven into pre-dug pits and buried alive. Numbers vary in the accounts, and modern historians warn that these figures are not stable. On-screen note, medieval chroniclers report 3,000 to 4,000 buried alive. Modern estimates caution these figures may be exaggerated or symbolic. Whether the total was in the low thousands or a smaller but still significant number, the act itself, the transformation of a guarantee into an instrument of terror, sent an unmistakable message. Timur controlled the script of surrender. Legalistic wording, a promise that sounded humane, could be turned into cruelty on his terms. The moral shock was the point. He wanted news of this cruelty to travel as far as possible, so that potential opponents would weigh surrender not simply as the end of immediate combat, but as a test of fate decided by the conqueror's whim. Why would a commander choose such a method? The explanation lies in strategic logic as much as personal psychology. Warfare on the Eurasian steppes and its borderlands was expensive in manpower and time. Timur's armies moved fast. They needed decisive outcomes. If surrender could be staged as a gamble that often ended in blood, then the mere threat of arbitrary punishment could function as a deterrent. But deterrence works in two directions. It discourages resistance among the weak, while terrorizing and demoralizing the strong. Timur understood reputation as a force multiplier. If your name alone could make cities capitulate without siege, you saved resources and spread influence faster than if you had to fight every battle to exhaustion. There is another layer. The explicit legalism, the promise of no bloodshed, converted the act into a moral trap that magnified the perceived treachery in a way that raw slaughter could not. By promising mercy and then rescinding it, Timur made himself the arbiter of fate and the author of betrayal. News of such betrayals traveled like wildfire. It did not simply recount loss, it recorded humiliation, the sense of being tricked by the rules of war. A man who could be bound by words and then cut them loose at will seemed more terrifying than a blunt, predictable beast of war. Recorders of the event were often keen to emphasize the cruelty. Their accounts, shaped by politics and personal bias, must be read with care. Chroniclers sometimes inflated tallies or infused episodes with moralistic language designed to define Timur as either a villain or a divinely sanctioned avenger, depending on the reader's sympathies. Modern scholars therefore present ranges and caveats. Still, the pattern across multiple sources is consistent enough. Leaders and garrisons who trusted Timur's guarantees sometimes found that the guarantees meant what he wanted them to mean. The lesson for rulers in the region was stark: negotiate on his terms or pay a price that would be recounted for generations. If that sounds like the behavior of a man without restraint, note that Timur could also be deliberately calculating in showing mercy when it served his purpose. He spared some cities and rulers when the political calculus called for it, integrating them as vassals or redirecting their elites into administrative roles. The cruelty was selective and often theatrical, designed to produce maximum psychological effect with minimum long-term administrative cost. The skulls and the public spectacles were not merely acts of vengeance, they were instruments in a campaign of reputation building. After Sivas, the pace accelerates and the methods change, shifting from juridical cruelty to symbolic erasure. If burial alive demonstrates a manipulation of promise, the next series of acts demonstrates a desire not only to destroy people, but to erase identity. Urgench of the lower Amudarya near the Aral Sea was a wealthy Silk Road city, an urban center of trade, learning, and craft. Its prosperity made it a target, and its symbolic weight gave its destruction a message. When the city resisted or was judged to have betrayed an agreement, Timur's response, according to several contemporary accounts, was not mere killing, but a campaign of annihilation. The walls were torn down, the population slaughtered or driven away. And in some chronicles, the fields were plowed and sown with grain, as if to convert the urban fabric into farmland. One particularly striking claim holds that the conquerors sowed the ruins with barley, a symbolic planting meant to mark the city as dead and useless to any future urban life. These reports have a double valence. They are both literal descriptions in some accounts and metaphorically potent in others. On-screen note, some chroniclers claim the ruins were sown with barley. Modern historians debate whether this was literal practice or symbolic rhetoric. If true in the literal sense, planting grain over ruins could be read as the ultimate erasure, a guarantee there would be no comeback. If symbolic, the story still served the same function. It communicated that the city's identity had been ended. Why choose erasure over occupation? A conquered, functioning city requires governance, tax collection, and integration. Historical empires often preferred to extract resources through existing structures rather than destroy them. Erasure is more costly in the short term, but offers symbolic permanence. For Timur, wiping a city off the map could be a message to neighboring polities. Resist, and you will not only be defeated, but erased from memory. It is a severe form of deterrence. When public memory itself becomes a battlefield, whole communities learn the stakes of defiance. Reports of Urgent's destruction also speak to the intersection of cultural trauma and material loss.
A city's libraries, workshops, and courts are repositories of knowledge and identity. Destroying them does more than remove a tax base. It impoverishes the intellectual and social networks that sustain a civilization. Timur's campaigns did not uniformly target learning. He spared mosques and patronized scholars in other instances. But the selective destruction magnified the terror. The message: institutions and symbols can be preserved or destroyed according to the political logic of submission. In this way, Timur framed himself as a maker and unmaker, a judge of cities' fates. If Sivas dramatized how promises could be transformed into punishment, Urgent showed the extremes of symbolic annihilation. But Timur's repertoire of terror included theatrical publicity, trophies so visible they turned the conquered landscape into a permanent, humiliating exhibition. Isfahan, a Persian cultural heartland, provides one of the more documented and horrifying examples of theatrical vengeance. The city surrendered to Timur under terms that, by one account or another, allowed a measure of safety for its inhabitants. Then, after a rebellion or breach of terms, Timur's response escalated into a public performance of punishment. Chroniclers describe mass executions and the creation of towering displays, piles of skulls arranged in public view. One medieval observer wrote in a tone intended to capture the moral weight of the spectacle, detailing how the skull towers rose like macabre minarets. On-screen note: chroniclers describe towers of skulls. Numbers vary widely. Treat such claims with caution. Some may be rhetorical devices. The image of skull towers serves multiple purposes at once. It is a trophy in the Roman sense, proof of victory and a humiliation of the defeated. It is also an instrument of terror, visible to anyone who traveled the roads or approached the city's ruins. The towers did not merely testify to death. They were curated reminders that resistance would convert people into monuments of warning. In terms of psychological warfare, such displays are efficient. They require little ongoing resources, but have an outsized effect on morale and reputation. How many died in Isfahan? Medieval accounts offer vast numbers, sometimes suggesting tens or hundreds of thousands. Modern historians approach these tallies with skepticism, noting that numerical exaggeration is a common rhetorical device, used to magnify an enemy's wickedness or a conqueror's might. Instead of a single definitive figure, scholars provide ranges and discuss methodology. Are the numbers cumulative over multiple events? Are they reasonable given city populations and logistics? On-screen note: medieval counts tens to hundreds of thousands. Modern estimates often lower. Historians stress evidence limits.
The important point for understanding historical consequence is not the precise digit, but the pattern. Isfahan's population and infrastructure suffered catastrophic damage, and the spectacle of skull towers became part of Tamer's brand. Spectacle also functioned domestically. Timur wanted to impress not only outsiders but his own recruits and allies. The ability to convert victory into visible, controlled theater reinforced the loyalty of commanders who benefited from plunder and prestige. For a ruler building an empire from a base of tribal loyalties and military retinues, visible proof of toughness and capacity could consolidate power as effectively as administrative reform. Fear could be remunerative. Commanders who served Timur knew that a successful operation might be rewarded with shares of plunder and positions in a growing polity. At the same time, the knowledge that their lord commanded extremes of punishment made them formidable in negotiations. From Isfahan, the narrative turns south and east to one of the most controversial episodes in Tamer's career, the Indian campaign and the sack of Delhi. The accounts that reach us from this period combine tactical ingenuity with mass-scale calamity, and they force careful parsing. Tamer's invasion of northern India touched a land of complex polities and enormous riches. Delhi was the heart of a sultanate that, for centuries, had been a major node in the political life of the subcontinent. The city's defenders had war elephants, living tanks whose presence on the battlefield could shatter infantry lines and silence cavalry charges. Timur, who had observed such forces in other contexts, found a way to counter them. Several chroniclers recount that he prepared caravans of camels loaded with flammable materials and set them alight at a crucial moment, turning the animals into a seething, fiery mass that panicked the elephants. The elephants, disoriented and terrified, broke ranks, trampling their own formations and leaving the army exposed. Tactical ingenuity is one thing, the aftermath is another. Reports from near-contemporary sources claim that Timur captured a great number of prisoners. Some chroniclers say as many as 100,000 were taken captive in the wake of Delhi's fall. On-screen note, chroniclers claim up to 100,000 prisoners. Modern historians caution these figures may include exaggerations or refer to cumulative numbers. What happened to the captives is debated in sources and analysis. Some accounts record mass executions ordered by Timur before pressing on with his campaign, reasoning that leaving so many captives behind risked rebellion and logistical strain. Other interpretations suggest that many were sold into slavery or incorporated into labor pools. The sack of Delhi stretched over days with widespread looting, arson, and the breakdown of civic order. The economic and demographic impact was severe. Some scholars argue that the city took decades to regain its standing in the region. Beyond the immediate killing and plunder, the long-term effect was to destabilize the Sultanate, opening power vacuums and redirecting trade and political attention elsewhere. If Timur's motive was strategic demolition, removing a rival power base, then the tactic had both immediate tactical advantages and enduring geopolitical consequences. If his motive was also economic, harvesting wealth and captives, the campaign fulfilled multiple functions of conquest at once. A recurring problem in assessing the Delhi episode, as with other campaigns, is separating prose intended to moralize from sober reportage. Many chroniclers were writing for patrons, and numbers could be inflated, either to glorify Timur's victory or to depict the suffering of the local population. Modern historians therefore combine documentary criticism with archaeological and demographic evidence to provide more cautious narratives. The upshot is that while the broad outlines, flaming camels, mass sack, lasting damage, are credible, the scale often needs contextualizing. There is an important tactical lesson embedded in the Delhi campaign. Timur's forces displayed an ability to combine rapid movement with innovative countermeasures. The burning camel stratagem is a concise illustration of battlefield creativity. Take the enemy's strength and turn it into a liability. But Timur's genius lay not only in singular cleverness, it lay in how he translated battlefield successes into political coups. Striking a capital not only filled his coffers, but sent a message across the subcontinent that his army could topple even the most formidable of urban centers. Reputation again amplified force. From here, the story darkens further. Timur's invasions of Mesopotamia, epitomized by his assault on Baghdad, reveal an escalation towards systematic, almost industrialized violence. The accounts that surround Baghdad combine claims of quotas, trophies, and cultural predation into a narrative that is simultaneously chilling and analytically rich. When Timur advanced on Baghdad, the city still bore traces of its former glory as Abbasid capital and an intellectual hub. Its libraries, mosques, and civic institutions made it symbolically crucial. Chroniclers describe a campaign in which Timur's soldiers were tasked with collecting heads as proof of kills, sometimes reportedly a requirement that each soldier return with multiple severed heads. The result, according to the narratives, was an urban landscape punctuated by scores of skull towers, piled along roads and plazas. Such a practice institutionalizes violence in a way that goes beyond ad hoc slaughter. Quotas convert atrocity into a bureaucratic performance. Soldiers keep accounting, commanders monitor totals, and the ruler publicly displays the results. The psychological and social effects are multifold.
For vanquished populations, it signals the thoroughness of defeat. For observers, it normalizes extremes as routine instruments of control. For an empire built from a loose coalition of warriors and administrators, institutionalized terror can become part of governance, a clear, if brutal, way to align incentives and deter dissent. Here again, numbers and motifs must be treated cautiously. Medieval sources were often eyewitnesses, but they were also storytellers. Modern historians cross-reference and contextualize, noting that claims of thousands of skull towers may be rhetorical, designed to communicate the scale of devastation rather than to supply an accurate architectural inventory. On-screen note, medieval sources claim widespread skull towers and quotas for heads. Historians warn these could be rhetorical amplifications. Still, the pattern of organized, quota-driven violence, even at smaller scales, indicates a ruler who thought systematically about how to make terror an element of statecraft. Even as he razed libraries and executed mass punishments, Timur sometimes preserved certain religious spaces, mosques and shrines, either out of political calculation or personal predilection. That selective mercy complicates simplistic interpretations. It underscores that Timur was not driven by a blanket ideology of annihilation. Rather, he was a practitioner of ruthless pragmatism. Destroy where it made sense to send a message. Preserve where it could help legitimize his rule or placate local opinion. This cultivated ambivalence, destroying a city's cultural repositories while sparing its mosques, for instance, made his rule both feared and, for some time, functionally dominant. By this point in the narrative, an observer must ask, what was the cumulative effect? Timur did create a vast empire in geographic terms. He mobilized an efficient military machine, moved wealth across continents, and left a mark on art and architecture. Yet his political constructions were often brittle. The terror tactics that helped produce quick submission and sustained reputation did not always translate into durable institutions. When Timur died, the empire fragmented as regional powers reasserted themselves and succession disputes consumed his heirs. The same methods that manufactured fear were insufficient to create a resilient bureaucratic order. So where does that leave us? We have traced a pattern. Calibrated cruelty at Sivas that weaponized promises. Symbolic erasure at Urgench that sought to obliterate a city's memory. Theatrical skull towers at Isfahan, tactical brutality and mass captivity at Delhi, and quota-driven public punishment at Baghdad. Each episode reveals a different instrument in the same toolbox, a toolbox aimed at making fear itself a strategic resource.
But these are more than mere instruments. They are choices with consequences that ripple through economics, demography, culture, and memory. What follows next in our examination is the deeper analysis of Baghdad's aftermath, the logistical implications of quota-based killing, the cultural losses inflicted when libraries were burned, and how medieval news networks spread stories of these atrocities far beyond their immediate theater. We will also interrogate the historiographical debates over casualty figures and try to overlay modern estimates on the medieval narratives, carefully distinguishing literary emphasis from plausible demographic impact. The conveyor belt of conquest moved on, and Timur's reputation traveled faster than his armies. For some rulers, the name alone sufficed to secure submission. For others, it became an invitation to desperate alliance building. But the cost of manufacturing terror as statecraft was not only moral, it was structural. The territories Timur briefly controlled were stitched together through fear more than through enduring administrative integration. After his death, the fabric unraveled, and the regions he had once dominated slipped into the hands of new powers. We will return with closer readings of particular chroniclers, identifying where their politics may have shaped their reports, where archaeology corroborates or contradicts them, and how modern historians calibrate numbers to population estimates and logistical realities. We will examine the practicalities of mass killing in the pre-modern era, how armies disposed of bodies, the strain on supply lines, and the ripple effects on famine and disease. We will also trace the cultural consequences, which institutions were destroyed, which were preserved, and what that tells us about Timur's strategic reasoning. For now, imagine the scale. Imagine columns of refugees pushed from ruined suburbs, roads lined with trophies meant to terrify, markets silent where once goods moved freely, and scholars who had to flee the ash of their libraries. Imagine rulers weighing the price of resistance, fight and risk annihilation, surrender and risk a promise turned to punishment. That calculus of fear, of reputation, of strategic cruelty was the engine of Timur's expansion. It changed not only the map, but the ways rulers thought about coercion. As we move into the next section, we will step more carefully into Baghdad's aftermath and into the historiology that complicates our numbers and narratives. We will also begin to ask what it means in moral and historical terms to have an empire built on terror, how that legacy persisted and how it faded. But before we do that, it is worth lingering on a final, disquieting image from the campaigns we have already covered. A leader who could, with a single decree, convert surrender into a public lesson. A conqueror who could erase a city's name as if clearing a board. A general who turned the spoils of victory into public sculptures of shame. Those images are not merely sensational, they are strategic and, in the long run, self-defeating.
Historians will continue to debate the numbers and the motives. Medieval chroniclers will remain indispensable witnesses, even when their prose breathes exaggeration. Archaeologists, demographers, and comparative military historians will keep refining our estimates. But the broader pattern is undeniable. Timur weaponized terror in multiple, repeatable ways, producing both short-term expansion and long-term instability. Next, we will return to Baghdad and examine how quotas and trophies operated in practice, how the cultural losses from burned libraries reshaped intellectual networks, and how news of such atrocities spread through diplomatic correspondence and merchant routes. We will also turn to the question that haunts historians debating Timur's place in the story of Eurasia. Did the terror he used ultimately produce an empire, or did it merely create the illusion of power, an empire more remembered than maintained? What follows is not a catalogue of grotesques for the morbidly curious. It is an attempt to trace how organized cruelty can become statecraft, and then to measure, as best historians can, the human and institutional cost when violence is made systematic.
Baghdad's aftermath offers the clearest vista into that process. There, the stories of quotas, towers, and burnt collections intersect with the practical realities of moving armies, feeding captives, and administering an empire stretched across deserts and steppe. Timur's occupation of Baghdad struck at a place that still shimmered with symbolic weight. It was not only a prize of prestige, it was a node in intellectual and commercial networks that tied the Islamic world to merchants, scholars, and clerics across Eurasia. Destroying or degrading those nodes inflicted damage that radiated outward. Chroniclers, often writing within a generation of the events, emphasize the cultural loss. Burned books, ruined scriptoria, scattered scholars. Yet they wrote with the rhetorical flair of a time that equated ruin with moral judgment. Modern historians therefore ask careful questions. Which collections were taken or destroyed? Which books were looted? And how much of the material loss can be corroborated through manuscript provenance, buyer records, or the sudden absence of texts in later libraries? The logistics of mass violence matter here because they reveal the limits of even the most fearsome ruler. Organizing an army to sack a city is one thing. Organizing an army to perform that sacking at scale, taking captives, executing quotas, maintaining supply lines, and moving on, requires infrastructure. Timur's campaigns were notable for the speed of their marches and the discipline of their logistics. When quotas for severed heads or other trophies were imposed, they turned the act of killing into a measurable obligation. Soldiers returned with proof. Commanders tallied returns. Leaders displayed results. The display, in turn, performed political theater. An assembled heap of skulls or a field strewn with ruined houses proved the conqueror's reach. But quotas also produce unintended consequences. For an army on the move, handling thousands of corpses and congregations of captives presents sanitary and supply challenges. Bodies left in the open accelerate the spread of disease. Mass displacements disrupt harvest cycles and markets. Confiscated grain fields or burned granaries lead to local famines that can then ripple outward. Chroniclers occasionally hint at such knock-on effects. Modern scholars, drawing on climate records, settlement archaeology, and population modeling, have begun to estimate the demographic costs of large-scale campaigns. Their conclusions are cautious. While identifying exact death tolls is fraught, the combination of wartime killings, flight, famine, and disease could reduce local populations by large percentages in affected regions over decades. We should pause briefly to highlight how historians approach numbers in this context. Medieval accounts sometimes give astonishing tallies. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even a claimed million in the rhetoric of catastrophe. On-screen note, medieval chroniclers often use large figures for rhetorical effect. Modern estimates range lower and must be evaluated against demographic plausibility. Modern historians triangulate such claims with plausible population baselines, archaeological settlement patterns, and evidence of urban continuity or collapse. For example, when a source claims that a city lost 100,000 people, scholars ask, was the city's population plausibly that high? Did contemporaneous tax records, if any survive, support such a number? Could the reported figure be cumulative across multiple years or multiple sites? The result is rarely a single number, and more often a probabilistic range that highlights severe loss without endorsing medieval hyperbole. Out of the practical necessities of war emerged narratives that dramatized the conqueror's control. The skull towers and barrowed pits were both instruments and symbols. In some regions, piled skulls decorated roads or city approaches, a message visible to merchants, envoys, and future invaders alike. In others, pits and mass graves carried the same lesson in a less ostentatious form.
Whether every skull tower reported by chroniclers was literally constructed, or whether some accounts used the image rhetorically to convey total ruin, the record is clear about intent. Timur wanted witnesses. He wanted his actions to be seen, discussed, and remembered. That desire to be remembered leads us to an uncomfortable paradox. Tamerlane understood the value of cultural production as well as destruction. He built magnificent palaces and mosques in Samarkand. He gathered artisans and scholars around his court and invested in architecture, calligraphy, and urban design.
The Timurid patronage of the arts later produced an aesthetic flowering that influenced Persianate culture for generations. Yet the same ruler who raised azure domes also razed cities and burned libraries. Why preserve some cultural forms while obliterating others? The answer lies again in politics and calculation. Preserving religious buildings and cultivating a courtly culture helped legitimize conquest in the eyes of subjects and rivals. Destroying civic institutions and archives could be an efficient way to break resistance and erase rival claims to authority. By protecting certain monuments, Timur could project a veneer of piety and order, even as his campaigns ripped through social fabric elsewhere. This selectivity complicates attempts to place Timur neatly into categories. He was neither a destroyer of all culture nor a mere patron. He was, above all, a pragmatist whose choices reflected the political utility of cultural objects. The net effect was paradoxical. Samarkand became a center of refined taste and learning, even as entire regions suffered intellectual impoverishment. That duality would shape the Timurid legacy, an artistic and architectural imprint superimposed atop scars of violence. As news of Timur's deeds spread, a secondary campaign unfolded, the campaign of reputation. Merchants, envoys, and pilgrims carried tales across trade routes. Scribes and minstrels relayed them in courts. Reputation operated as a kind of currency. A ruler's fame for severity could reduce the number of sieges required to expand territory. Governors, hearing the reports, might submit rather than fall to armies, and that submission saved forces, horses, and time. But reputation is brittle when applied as a substitute for governance. Controlling territory requires more than symbolic dominance. It demands fiscal systems, local elites willing to collaborate, and succession mechanisms to bind conquered regions into a durable polity. Timur's empire, for all its territorial breadth, often lacked those durable administrative fibers. It was held together by the charisma and coercive capability of a single man and his immediate network of commanders. The Timurid polity after Timur's death in 1405 splintered as rival emirs and family members contended for power. The title of conqueror did not translate easily into an institutional structure that could outlast his household. In that sense, terror was an engine for rapid expansion, but a poor foundation for long-term statecraft. Post-Timur dynamics also illustrate an essential point about historical causality. Atrocities can create both short-term compliance and long-term resistance. In regions where social institutions were destroyed, recovery was slow. Agricultural production declined, urban life contracted, districts depopulated. Yet the branding of terror also nurtured resentment, cycles of revenge, and the realignment of political networks, factors that could encourage rebellion once a central coercive force faded. Thus, the very instrument that generated immediate empire sowed seeds of fragility. The memory of Timur's campaigns also changed over time. Contemporary and near-contemporary chronicles were written in contexts shaped by politics, some to vilify, others to praise. Centuries later, Timur became a figure in Persian and Central Asian historiography whose likeness was refracted through changing agendas. In some Persianate accounts, he was a scourge, in others, an agent of divine punishment or even a patron of the arts. Ottoman writers, Mughal chroniclers, and later European travelers reinterpreted his life variously, adding layers of myth and moralizing. This shifting memory complicates modern attempts to recover a straightforward portrait. Modern scholarship, meanwhile, has benefited from interdisciplinary tools. Archaeologists have surveyed destroyed sites. Paleoclimatologists have traced crop failures and droughts. Manuscript historians have tracked losses and survivals of texts. All of these approaches refine our sense of the past in ways that everyday chronicles cannot. They do not eliminate uncertainty, but they reduce reliance on single, often polemical medieval narratives. The upshot is a view of Timur as an extraordinarily effective military entrepreneur who leveraged terror as a strategy and also as a ruler whose methods had high administrative and moral costs. What about the people who bore the brunt of these campaigns? Chroniclers sometimes foreground the rulers and armies. Other sources give glimpses of civilian life under duress. Refugee flows disrupted neighboring regions. Craftsmen and scholars fled to safer courts, changing the intellectual geography of a generation. Slave markets grew as captives were sold. Labor pools were reconstituted as populations were relocated. The human consequences went beyond the immediate fatalities to reshape labor patterns, demographic composition, and cultural transmission. A final piece in this puzzle is comparative perspective. What makes Timur's actions historically significant is not only their scale, but also how he systematized terror in multiple ways. Legalistic betrayal, symbolic erasure, theatrical monuments, tactical brutality, and institutional quotas. These were not isolated acts of savagery. They were coordinated instruments used across different theaters to produce predictable psychological effects. That repeatability is part of what changed political calculations in the region. Rulers now had a template for how terror could be operationalized and displayed. But the template has limits. The experience of the Timurid state after Timur's passing demonstrates that terror, while potent, cannot substitute for governing institutions if the aim is durable rule.
The Timurid realm fragmented. Successor states reconstituted power on different bases: administration, kinship, religion, or regional diplomacy. Meanwhile, the cultural fruits of Timur's patronage, Samarkand's monuments, patronage of the arts, endured in ways his skull towers could not. Monuments to art outlived monuments to terror because they served civic functions and fostered loyalty among elites, not just fear among the vanquished. Ethically, historians must do two things at once: condemn the violence and explain it. Condemnation recognizes the moral atrocity of transforming human beings into instruments of political theater. Explanation locates that atrocity in context, logistical constraints, political aims, the psychology of reputation, and the militarized economy of pre-modern Eurasia. Neither approach should excuse the actions. Understanding motive and mechanism is not the same as exonerating the actor. How did these events change history? First, they altered demographics and urban life cycles across a broad swath of Eurasia. Second, they shifted political norms. Terror became part of the repertoire of statecraft. Third, they reconfigured cultural geographies. Some cities declined or changed character, while others, like Samarkand, rose as new centers of creativity. Fourth, they reshaped memory and historiography. Timur's image became a moral and political symbol adapted to later narratives. And finally, there is the matter of long-term reputation. Timur's name carried a kind of dark momentum. Stories of his deeds were used by later rulers as warnings, by poets as moral exempla, and by scholars as objects of inquiry. His short-lived empire left an imprint in art and architecture that was at once striking and contradictory. On one hand, Timur built things meant to last. On the other, he acted in ways that undermined the very social conditions that sustain permanence. When we close this account, the title we began with should read not merely as sensational promise, but as question. How did Tamerlane's most horrifying deeds change history forever? The answer is complex. They changed immediate political calculations, demography, and cultural transmission.
They provided a model of terror as a strategic instrument. They also demonstrated the fragility of empires built more on fear than on institutional cohesion. In the longue durée, his rule was a catalyst, producing short-term expansion, long-term cultural reverberations, and a historiographical legacy that continues to fascinate and unsettle. In the end, we are left with images that endure because they speak to an uncomfortable human truth. Power can be wielded through terror, and terror can succeed, briefly. But power built on terror faces an existential problem. It relies on the continued presence of a figure willing and able to execute it. Remove that figure, and the edifice often crumbles.
Perhaps the gravest legacy of Timur is the lesson that ruthless efficiency can win battles but rarely secures a lasting polity of stable civil life. Which of these acts struck you as most consequential? Savasa's betrayal, Urgent's erasure, Isfahan's theatrical cruelty, Delhi's tactical devastation, or Baghdad's institutionalized violence? Tell us in the comments which episode disturbed you most and why. If you want a detailed list of sources and further reading, check the description for links to chronicle translations, archaeological reports, and modern histories that attempt to parse myth from likely reality. History asks hard questions about human agency, responsibility, and the costs of conquest. Tamerlane, Timur, remains a figure who forces us to confront those questions. How do we remember atrocity? How do we measure it? And how do we learn from it without falling into the trap of myth-making? If you found this exploration useful, subscribe and join us for more deep dives into the darker corners of history.